So, what happens when a company is built with public money, but the government's own anti-corruption watchdog says it can't investigate? It sounds impossible, right? Well, today we're going to unpack a real Supreme Court case that tackles that exact puzzle.
Our story kicks off where a lot of these legal battles do, a business deal that went completely south. Back in 1996, a big shipping company called ITTC locked in a one-year contract to haul coconut oil. But just a few months in, their clients, a group of 3 oil companies, just suddenly tore up the agreement. No warning, no notice. The deal just, poof, collapsed.
Now, this wasn't just some simple disagreement over a contract. The head of the shipping company, a guy named Leyson Jr., he was convinced something much shadier was going on. He filed a complaint, basically saying the executives at these oil companies canceled his contract in bad faith, faked documents, and then handed the new, more expensive contract to someone else. We're talking millions of dollars on the line.
So Leyson does what you'd think he should do. He takes these pretty serious corruption claims to the Office of the Ombudsman, the main agency that handles this stuff. But their response was a total shocker. They said they couldn't investigate because the companies were private. And that single decision right there is what sent this whole thing spiraling all the way up to the Supreme Court.
So how did the Supreme Court figure this all out? We're going to walk through it piece by piece. We'll look at the contract that fell apart, the whole question of who has the authority to investigate, this really powerful public funds argument, the official legal test the court had to use, how the companies actually did on that test, and of course, the final verdict that settled everything.
All right, first things first. Let's go back to the beginning and get a closer look at the business deal that lit the fuse on this whole legal explosion.
And wow, this all happened really fast. February 1996, the ink is barely dry on the contract. By August, it's ripped to shreds. Leyson files his complaint the next March, but less than a year later, in January 98, the Ombudsman just tosses the case out. And that's what really set the stage for the big fight to come.
So the Ombudsman's decision pretty much stopped the investigation dead in its tracks. But why? Well, it all came down to this really critical legal idea called jurisdiction. Basically, who has the power to investigate whom? The Ombudsman's reason was actually super simple. They didn't even touch on the corruption allegations. Their whole argument was, look, these are private companies. Their executives are private citizens. Therefore, our hands are tied. We can't investigate.
And this is exactly why that private versus public distinction was everything. The Ombudsman's entire reason for existing is to hold public officials accountable. So if these executives weren't considered public officers, then the Ombudsman literally had no authority to step in, no matter how serious the accusations were.
But Leyson was not giving up. He took his case to the Supreme Court, and he came armed with a counter-argument that honestly just feels like common sense.
His whole appeal boiled down to this one crucial fact. These weren't just any old companies. They were built using money from something called the Coconut Industry Investment Fund, which all came from the coconut levy, a tax that coconut farmers have been paying for decades. And here's the real kicker. Leyson was able to point to older Supreme Court cases that had already decided clear as day that this coconut levy money counted as public funds. Why? Because it was collected through the government's power to tax, and it was supposed to be for a public purpose.
And that was the core of his argument. It's pretty compelling, isn't it? If your entire company was bankrolled with money the government collected from the public, how can you possibly claim you're purely private and shouldn't be held accountable? It seems totally logical. But for the Supreme Court, logic just wasn't enough. They needed a legal standard.
So you've got this really strong common sense argument on one side. How does the Supreme Court make a final call? Well, they turn to a very clear, very specific legal test.
The court agreed that the public funds argument was powerful, but it couldn't be the only thing they looked at. To figure out if the Ombudsman had jurisdiction, they had to decide if these companies legally qualified as government-owned or controlled corporations, or GOCCs for short. And lucky for them, there was already an official test for that. And here it is, straight out of the administrative code. For a company to be a GOCC, it has to check all 3 of these boxes. It has to be a corporation, it has to serve some kind of public need, and, this is the big one, the government has to own at least 51% of it.
Okay, so with this clear 3-part test ready to go, the court could finally start digging in. So, how did these 3 oil companies stack up?
That 51% ownership rule is a hard and fast line, and it immediately knocked one company right out of the race. Legazpi Oil, with only 44.1% government ownership, failed the test on the spot. But the other 2, Grand Export and United Coconut, they easily cleared that bar with over 90% ownership.
But they still had to pass that second test. Do they perform a public function? The court compared them to a known GOCC, a company called Petrophil. The government had acquired Petrophil for a very clear public reason, to help secure the national oil supply. But when they looked at Granexport and United Coconut, the petitioner just couldn't provide any proof they were created for a similar public purpose. At the end of the day, their business was just business.
So the tests were done, and all the evidence was on the table. The Supreme Court was finally ready to make the call.
The final scorecard was pretty clear. Not a single one of the companies met all the legal criteria. Legazpi Oil failed on ownership. Granexport and United Coconut both failed on public function. The conclusion was unavoidable. Even though they were built with public funds, legally, none of them were government corporations.
And that was the final word from the Supreme Court. The Ombudsman was right all along. Because the companies didn't meet that strict legal definition of a GOCC, their executives were not public officers, and the anti-corruption agency had no power to investigate them. Case dismissed.
So, the legal puzzle is solved. The ruling gives us a clear answer based on the law, but it also shines a bright light on a potential gap in accountability. It leaves us with this one really critical question. When public money is used to create private power, who is ultimately minding the store?